all for coming so much today. Crazy weather and Father's Day and everything else. I'm glad you made it. I would like to, before we start, recognize our sponsors, the ones who give a little extra and really help us out. There are 3 different levels of donation, and the first is the bronze level, and they've contributed $100 or more. And that's Cornett Jewelers, Custom Air, Fraser Seaver Brown Funeral Service, Royal Oak Eye Care, and Dr. Paul Brown. Silver level.
Excuse me.
Okay, silver level is $250, and that's H.S. Williams, the Town of Chilhowie, and Royal Building Products. And our gold level sponsors, which is $500 or more, are the Bank of Marion and Slint, Grant, Saunders Insurance Company. So we appreciate that. And if you don't mind, I've got to do mine too. If you've got your phone and it's not on silent, if you'll just flip the button so that it doesn't go off in the middle of Rose's presentation. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I'd like to introduce our guest. She's awesome. I met Rose probably not in 2020 when she started working here, because I think it was COVID and everybody was kind of freaked, but a couple years later, and she's one nice woman to be acquainted with. I went and interviewed her yesterday at the library and kind of caught her off guard. I was like, okay, tell me where you were born. And so I got the background. I'm not sure if you know it. She was born at Andrews Air Force Base. And she was, it wouldn't be an Army, but Air Force brat? Air Force brat, okay. They moved around a lot. She's the oldest of 5 children. The one thing, I was a Spanish major and a history person at Emory. She's really the Spanish major. She started going to school in Texas in 6th grade, picked up Spanish really well, ended up taking it all the way through high school, and then she majored in Spanish at the university, which is now the University of Mary Washington. I think it was Mary Washington College. And then she also majored in international affairs, which I think is just fun. She met her husband, John, up at Mary Wash, and he is an imagery analyst. And I'm not quite sure. I know he loves maps. He loves plotting things on maps. And he's going to be our speaker in September. He has plotted the Revolutionary War graves here in the county. And he's going to come talk to us then. This is how smart she is. She took the Foreign Service test as a junior, and they told her to take it early because nobody ever passed it the first time, but she did. So she got to start all the paperwork and the background checks and all that early. So they called her in April of her senior year and said, well, you're in. And she went, I have to graduate from college first, please. And so she was telling me that within the span of like a month, she graduated from Mary Washington, married John, and entered the Foreign Service for the United States government. So that was one crazy spring for her. Let's see. She was in Foreign Service for 32 years, and she's got 2 sons. They're in their 30s. They're around the same age as my kids. They all live here in Virginia, and then she came, thank goodness, to Marion, and has been in charge of our library since 2020. So, Miss Rose, I will turn it over to you. Thank you. If you need anything, you want some water?
Yeah, maybe that would be okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a rainy Sunday afternoon, and happy Father's Day to everyone. As someone who has sat here enjoying these presentations for many times, I'm delighted to be able to make a contribution. I appreciate the Historical Society giving me the opportunity. So I want to give you a couple caveats before we start the presentation and a couple PowerPoint slides to share with y'all. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's like to be an American diplomat using my own experiences. They're my experiences. The other caveat is that I retired in 2013. So I have been out of the Foreign Service now for 12 years. So, undeniably things are probably a little bit different. So I can only really speak to my experience. So there's some of the things we're going to talk about. Because we're at the Historical Society, I feel like there should be a little bit of discussion about our diplomatic history. Then I'll talk about the places I've served, why it matters, some of the different adventures that I was fortunate enough to have, and then libraries, what brought me here. When I say face of America, I'll go back for a minute. The reason I think it's important is because that's what U.S. diplomats are, right? We are the face of our country overseas. And some people in many of the countries where we work and serve, we're the only Americans they may ever meet. And so you're always very conscious of that. But the other thing, oh, you can't hear me? Sorry. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay. The reason that it's important that we're faces is that because what you do as a diplomat is create relationships. If it was just about exchanging information back and forth with other countries, you could do that by mail, you could do that by fax, you could do that in a lot of different formats. But it's the people. People create relationships. And really that's what I did for 32 years. My job was to create relationships to help us achieve our objectives. The reason I think it's important to do this presentation, and some of you have been in this audience, have heard me do some element of this presentation in other places, is that so many Americans don't know what American diplomats do. You know, it is largely an unknown piece of our government because you serve overseas. You know, I served for 32 years, more than half of that was overseas. And you know, in the United States government, farmers know who is their agency in the US government. They know the Agriculture Department is for them. Commerce, business people know who their agent is in the United States government. Well, the State Department doesn't have that constituency, right? Most people don't think about what does the State Department do for me? Well, we're gonna talk a little bit today about some of the things the State Department does for all of us. The other reason I think it's important to have this conversation is that our founders knew that educated voters were important to the success of our democracy. And libraries are a part of that. Our job is to help connect people with information. So I'm here both as a former diplomat, but also as your librarian. So, back to our agenda. All right, so I'm not gonna go through all of the lines on that spreadsheet, on that slide. The thing I want you to take away from that is from the beginning of our nation, we have been engaged with the world. In October of 1776, Benjamin Franklin set out on our first diplomatic mission. We haven't won the war yet, but we knew we were going to need some help. And so he went to France to get help. And the French sent 12,000 soldiers and 32,000 sailors to fight in our war independence. They were there throughout. They loaned us money. They helped us buy weapons. So from the very beginning of our nation, we have been entwined with the world. And if you look just through that list of important elements, the Louisiana Purchase, what would our country have been without the expansion that the Louisiana Purchase made possible? In the Civil War, you know, the British and their role, you know, they were obviously still a little cranky about the fact that we were independent. And so one of the great scandals of the Civil War is the British declared neutrality. They weren't going to take anybody's side. They traded with the North and the South because they were looking to see how that was going to turn out. So at another critical juncture in our history, there was an international component that was fairly important. Obviously, World War I and World War II, we know how important it was that we were involved in the world. And then we get to the Cold War. I joined the Foreign Service in 1981, in June of 1981. And President Reagan took office in January of 1982, and the Iranian government released the hostages. Again, that was such a delicate moment in our national history. We were all traumatized as a nation by the idea that American diplomats could be held for more than a year by people who did not wish us well. And you know, to this day, we live with the repercussions of that event. We do not have a normal relationship with Iran, and we may never have a normal relationship with Iran because we haven't recovered from that moment. and then of course everything that we've all lived through since 9/11. So, what are the themes that come out of those diplomatic history events? You know, we've always gone back and forth between isolationism and interventionism, right? There have been times in our history, remember, you know, Roosevelt and World War II. We didn't get in right away, right? We gave the Brits some Lend-Lease materials. We tried to do everything possible to not get involved in Europe's fight, because many people felt like, we already did that, been there, done that, we don't need to get involved again. And then inevitably, Pearl Harbor happened, and we didn't have a choice anymore. So we have always gone back and forth, and the pendulum, as it has in various elements of our political history, has gone back and forth. Economic growth has always been a theme of our relationships with the world. You know, trade was very much involved in the war for independence, right? Our ability to trade freely with the countries in the Caribbean and with other countries was one of the complaints against the British Crown. They didn't want to allow us to trade independently. So economic growth and our ability to achieve our economic objectives has always been part of our history. Freedom and democracy, right? One of the things as an American diplomat that no matter which president I served under, our mandate was to advance the cause of democracy around the world. That has been a constant theme. I won't talk about the great powers and the balance of power, but there's always been a geopolitical element there. And then helping others. As Americans, we are incredibly generous, and it hurts us to see people living in poverty. It hurts us to see starving children, right? You remember seeing the famine in Ethiopia, and people opened their hearts. After, we'll get to the earthquake in El Salvador, after the earthquake in El Salvador, people came out of the woodwork in the United States, churches, civic groups, to help. They just wanted to come and help, because that's who we are as a country, as a people. We take care of each other at home, but we also reach out to people internationally who need help. So, what do diplomats do anyway? And again, these are core responsibilities. Every administration has its own priorities, and as a federal agency, the State Department works for the president, and the elections have consequences. You know, you work for the sitting president. Whatever his agenda is, as a public servant, that is your job. You do what the president instructs you to do, or you leave. Those are your choices. And so, but these, and every administration has different priorities. Some people want to emphasize China. Some people want to emphasize trade. But these core things are what we have done through history and we will continue to do. So the first job is protecting Americans overseas. Americans travel a lot. In 2024, 94 million Americans traveled overseas. Think about that for a minute. 94 million Americans. That's 28% of our population. Things happen to Americans when they travel overseas. The vast majority of them have a great experience and no trouble. But at the lighter end, the passport gets lost, the passport gets stolen, airplane tickets get lost. At the more serious end, you know, people die. People have major health issues. People get arrested. And so for that whole spectrum of American involvement overseas, the embassy or the consulate is there to support Americans. My first job in Monterrey, Mexico, I was a consular officer, and I rotated through the citizen services section, and one of my jobs was to go and visit the prisoners. Now, as you just heard, I was 22 years old, fresh out of undergrad, and the first time I set foot in a Mexican prison is still memorable. I had, in Monterrey, Mexico, I had a dozen Americans who were in jail, and it was my job to show up every month and check on them, just to see how they were. Are they still there? Are they being treated properly? Are they okay? And then legally, we were required to take them vitamins. And there's a piece of legislation that says every American prisoner should get vitamins every month. And so we arrived with our bottles of vitamins to hand to the prisoners. And I remember the first time going, and it's very scary, you know, it's huge, huge walls and guards everywhere and guns everywhere, and they take me to this conference room, and the prisoners all file in one at a time, and I have a list, and they all say, "Oh, you're new." Well, yes, I am. Nice to meet you. And I said, "How could you tell I was new?" And they said, "Well, you're wearing a suit. We haven't seen someone visit us wearing a suit in quite some time." I said, "Okay." One of the prisoners wasn't there. And I said, "Well, where is," and I will just use a random name, "where is Mr. Smith?" "Oh, it's okay, he got released." It's like, "What do you mean he got released? We're supposed to know about that." He said, "Well, he got released." I was like, "Well, so as we were wrapping up, I go to the office of the director of the prison to say, "I need to know where Mr. Smith is." He's like, "Oh, it's okay, he got released." And I said, "Well, I need something more. Is there a court order? Is there something?" He said, "No, it's okay, he got released." So I go back to the consulate and I say to my boss, "He's missing." And he said, "Oh, he probably just got released." I was like, "What does that mean? He got released." And they said, "Well, it means that his lawyer paid somebody off, and probably in the middle of the night they just let him go, and he's back across the border." I said, "Oh, okay, so that's how that goes." That was one of my first introductory lessons of taking care of Americans abroad. So that is a big part of what every embassy and every diplomat does overseas. The next thing you do is promote U.S. business. Again, I talked about economic growth, prosperity for the American people. So it's part of the job is to promote U.S. businesses, and that takes a lot of forms. It can be promoting travel to the United States. It can be literally introducing U.S. companies to foreign partners. As ambassador in El Salvador and Peru, in El Salvador, I was selling helicopter engines because Pratt & Whitney wanted to sell helicopter engines. The Salvadorans needed helicopter engines, and so I spent a lot of time taking the Pratt & Whitney people around the government of El Salvador, and thank goodness they bought those engines. The helicopter fleet was operational, and Pratt & Whitney was pretty happy. Same thing in Peru. Peru is very wealthy in minerals. They buy a lot of U.S. products, but there wasn't a single U.S. chain of fast food that wasn't present in Lima, Peru. They had Restaurant Row, and they would proudly drive you through, and you'd see Burger King and Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's and KFC. They were all there, and they'd say, "Isn't it great that we have so many American restaurants?" I said, "Yeah, lovely." But the next thing that happened was an actual steak restaurant called us and said, "We've just got a supply of USDA beef, and so we would like the ambassador to come and preside over our first meal served with USDA grade A beef in our restaurant." Because typically they had bought, in South America, they buy beef from Argentina. And so this restaurant was very proud that they were serving USDA grade A beef. And so I went to the restaurant and we had a lovely steak lunch and lots of people there taking pictures. Again, part of the job. Your job is to be the salesman for US products, US companies, in whatever capacity it comes up. Speaking for the United States, this is the more arcane, boring stuff, but as a country, we kind of send messages to people all the time. We ask for help on legal matters, for example. We have mutual legal assistance treaties with a lot of countries in the world. And so it's your job as the embassy to just take those messages into the government, usually to the foreign ministry, to say, "We would like for your help with this legal matter." Or we would like to talk to you about a tax exchange information agreement. I mean, really arcane, boring stuff, but it's the nuts and bolts of what you do as an American diplomat, speaking on behalf of our government to a foreign government. You also do things like respond to a crisis. When bad things happen, people need help, and they turn to us, and the embassy is the address for those requests. And finally, the Face of America part. Cultural exchanges, kind of going out and meeting people, sharing the richness of American culture. We very often had American musical groups. Back in the day when we had money for that, American jazz bands the State Department would contract them and set up an itinerary for them, and the embassy's job was to put together an event and have the American jazz band
come and play to share our unique American musical heritage. And those are obviously some of the most fun, exciting events you get to do. Sometimes we had art exhibits. When I was in Peru, we had some Native American weavers who came because there's a very strong textile tradition in Peru. And the American native weavers brought their looms, and the Peruvians brought their looms, and my whole living room was set up as a weaving workshop where they were trading techniques and learning how the Native Americans did this particular pattern and how the Peruvians did that pattern. But it was exactly the kind of cultural connection that we want to make, so that people see us as people who share the same values, the same interests, and the same traditions in our own unique way, rather than just seeing us as the powerful American military or whatever they see on the news every day, to actually meet Americans and get to know them as other human beings. The other part of cultural exchanges was encouraging people to study in the United States. And we will see right here why it matters. So I hate to be boring and show you all the numbers, but the numbers matter. So in 2024, $43.8 billion entered the US economy because foreign students chose to study here. And so figuring out who are the students best equipped to come and study here because they have the academic preparation, because they have the language skills that they need to be successful, and because they're legitimate students. That was part of our job as reviewing those applicants. But look at the exports and the imports. In Peru, again, to use that example, because it is a country where a lot of extractive industries, copper, silver, gold, they buy every single year, $1 billion worth of heavy machinery from Caterpillar. One company. Caterpillar sells $1 billion to one country. So think about that with 174 countries in the world, what that means to our economy. And we sell stuff too. That first number is what we sell to the world. Tourism, $1.9 trillion in tourism in the United States. Yes. 3 trillion in exports, 4 trillion in imports, 1.9 trillion in tourism. So our engagement with the world is not just to feel good, it is not just the people-to-people part, it's dollars and cents. Our economic prosperity is very much tied to our interaction with the world. All right, so here's the part we get to Rose's war stories, where these are the places I served. My first tour was in Monterrey, Mexico. It was a consulate in the northeastern part of the country. My second overseas tour was Paraguay. I was the political counselor there. My third overseas tour was Sofia, Bulgaria, where I was the number 2 in the embassy. I was there from 1994 to 1997, which was about 5 years after the Berlin Wall came down, and a very challenging time for them and for us. I was in El Salvador from 2000 to 2003, and then I was in Peru from 2010 to 2013. In between all of those assignments, I was back in Washington. One of the things that I discovered about myself is, while I love the overseas part, I also needed the policy part of being back in Washington. So it's great to be overseas and executing foreign policy, but I also needed to be back in Washington being part of formulating the process and helping inform how foreign policy is made at the Washington end. Between El Salvador and Peru, for example, when I came back from El Salvador, I was asked to go to the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and I was responsible for maintaining our coalitions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was asked to do that because the Salvadorans sent troops to Iraq when we asked them to. And for me, it's one of the most memorable experiences I had as an American diplomat. Washington sent out the instruction, everybody go in and recruit people to join the coalition in Iraq. And I went in to see the president of El Salvador, at that time was Francisco Flores, and I said to him, Mr. President, we'd like to ask you to participate in our coalition in Iraq. And he turned to me with tears in his eyes and said, "Of course we'll go, Rose. Of course we'll go. Because you bled for us in our time of crisis. Of course we'll go." And they did. The Salvadorans were among the only foreign partners who were there all the way through our presence in Iraq. There's a very famous story. Donald Rumsfeld gave 5 medals of valor to Salvadoran soldiers because there was a moment in Basra, down in southern Iraq, where the U.S. presence was under attack, and the Salvadorans ran out of ammunition and defended the American staff with knives and successfully protected everybody in that building. And they were recognized by the Secretary of Defense for their valor and being coalition partners. And so I guess based on that success, they asked me to go and wrangle the coalition, which was a very challenging job. I will not say it was my favorite job, but it was certainly interesting. I heard from everybody all the time. Another memorable exchange was when we were hosting the Polish defense minister, and one of our standard lines when foreign officials came in was to say to them, "Thank you so much for being part of the coalition." And so I start off with the Polish defense minister saying, "Thank you very much for being part of the coalition." And he just looked at me and said, "You have got to stop doing that." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We are a NATO ally. You don't have to thank us. We are doing this because it's in our best interest. It makes sense for us. So don't thank us, because that somehow makes our partnership less of a partner. I'm not doing you a favor. We are coming to this conflict because it's important for us." And that was an important lesson for me. So I stopped thanking people and started treating them as genuine allies who were there because they thought it was important for them. So these are the presidents. I mentioned President Reagan, President Bush, as you can see, both political parties. Each has a unique approach to foreign policy. As a career Foreign Service officer, I was a registered independent because my job was to be a professional civil servant. My job was not to choose sides. My job was to do what the president asked us to do. In general, Republicans are pretty good at foreign policy, or in my time, they certainly were. They were really good at establishing relationships. They were very businesslike, but always with a personal touch. First President Bush was very famous for the little notes he used to send to foreign leaders about anything. He would see something, a good news story, and he would just write them a little note. And those little human touches, those notes that he sent to people, made all the difference in creating those personal relationships. His son, President Bush, was better at the interpersonal stuff. He didn't do as much of the notes, but he loved to have people to the farm. You remember seeing him driving people around the ranch. He loved having people for a barbecue. He loved buying people cowboy boots to share, his America and his Texas heritage. President Obama made a lot of friends, again, by just doing that one-on-one interaction. And we'll see some pictures. These are the secretaries I worked with. You'll recognize most of them. The black and white photo on the top row is Larry Eagleburger, and he's probably the one I knew best. He was a retired Foreign Service officer, and when James Baker went to run President Bush's unsuccessful re-election campaign, he made Larry Eagleburger Secretary of State. And I worked for him both as Deputy Secretary and then when he became Secretary. He came to Paraguay when I was there, and I was his control officer, meaning I ran him around and did, set up his appointments, took him to all the places he needed to go to. And then at the end, last night, we were getting ready to send him on his way the next morning. He turned around and said, "You should come work for me." And my ambassador was standing there and said, "Oh no, she's got another year. She can't leave yet." He said, "That's okay. I'll have a job next year too. Come work for me next year." And I did. And he was one of his champion causes in the State Department and in the U.S. government was supporting U.S. business. And so he, in addition to handling Latin America for him, I also handled his business accounts. And so most US companies by that point knew that if they had a problem overseas, they could call Larry Eagleburger. And he would call me and say, okay, let's sort this out. Let's figure it out. So we did everything from trying to help Newport News Shipbuilding sell liquefied natural gas carriers to Qatar, when Qatar was first getting into the gas exporting business, to trying to help companies who build stuff in Saudi Arabia get paid. The Saudis are very famous for not paying their bills. They'll invite a company in, they'll have a very big project, they will commit to $400 billion, and then after halfway through, they stop paying the bill. And so getting the Saudis to pay their bills was one of the things that he did. Talking to the Japanese about opening their markets was another one of the things that he did. So I learned an awful lot from working with him. Secretary Albright, obviously the first female Secretary of State. I worked for her for 2 years, handling Latin America, Asia, and the business portfolio for her as well. Secretary Powell, who I think is probably the greatest natural leader I have ever seen. His very first day at the State Department, you may have seen the picture of the State Department lobby, the C Street lobby with all the flags across the top that they very often show on the nightly news. So on the first day that a secretary shows up, they typically have an all-call meeting where everybody's invited to come to the lobby, and the secretary stands up on the landing and talks to everybody. And Colin Powell stood up there and said, I'm a soldier. I don't really know about being a diplomat. I need you guys. You guys know how to do this. I don't. I'm a soldier. I know how to lead soldiers. I will tell you the same thing I told every one of my soldiers. I will always have your back. And in that moment, you watched 20,000 people around the world melt into a puddle of jelly to do whatever Secretary Powell asked them to do. Because you have a lot of type A personalities who want to be successful, who want to help, who have a lifetime of experience and expert knowledge that they just want to put to use. And Colin Powell was so smart to know that and to appeal to people to say, you have the knowledge, help me do what we need to do. And he was terrific. Condi Rice worked for President Bush. She was very much a team player. By that point, that was when I was in political military affairs, and we tussled with DOD every single day, the Department of Defense. And some of the issues were really tough and confrontational, and she'd call me and say, Rose, we're all on the president's team. I understand we may be right, we may have precedent on our side, but the president expects us to get the job done, so just get it done. And we would get it done. And then Secretary Clinton, also just one of the smartest people I've ever met. I was in Peru when she was Secretary of State, and she, in any room, I thought I was well prepared, and I'd sit down at the table and she would ask a question I didn't have the answer to. She had read all of her briefing materials, understood what was behind them, what the issues were, and could always identify the thing that was the weak point or the thing that might be a vulnerability for us. But I learned an awful lot from her too. So, all right, if y'all don't mind, I'm going to sit here for a minute. Can you still hear me now? Okay. So, some of the adventures. I mentioned Paraguay. In 1989, the military ruler, Alfredo Stroessner, I think there are probably people in this room who still remember hearing Alfredo Stroessner. He was a military dictator for 34 years. And he was very repressive, he was very violent, he had the country on lockdown. So I got there, when I got there, he had been in power for 34 years, and we did not have a great relationship with him. The previous ambassador had hosted a lot of opposition people in the embassy, and Stroessner ordered the police and the military to throw tear gas bombs into the embassy, which they did, which obviously created a diplomatic scandal that the sitting president would tear gas the American embassy. So we weren't in really good terms with Stroessner by the time I got there. About 6 months after I got there, there was a coup. President Stroessner's daughter, or President Stroessner's son was married to the daughter of General Rodriguez. General Rodriguez was kind of the senior ranking military figure. He commanded the cavalry, which was the most powerful military unit in Paraguay. And he decided that they needed to be done with Stroessner. And so he mounted a coup that was very successful. It was over in about 6 hours. After 34 years of believing this guy was impossible to remove, he was on a plane to Brazil in 6 hours. And there was just, celebrations. Then a picture in black and white on the left is a picture of people just riding their cars through downtown Asuncion, celebrating the departure of Stroessner from Paraguay. And so that night, my ambassador got a call from General Rodriguez who said, Mr. Ambassador, we're going to make a democracy now, but we're going to need some help because we don't really know how to do that. Would you be willing to help us out? Ambassador said, well, I need to talk to folks in Washington, but I think we can do that. Now, Rodriguez also had a checkered reputation as being involved in drug trafficking. So when my ambassador called Washington and said, guess what? General Rodriguez is in charge now. He wants to make Paraguay a democracy. We should jump right on that. Washington said, oh, not so fast. We really think that he's a bad guy. He's a drug trafficker. After all, he mounted a coup. Why would we want to have anything to do with him? The ambassador very wisely said, well, it can't be worse than the guy who just left, so we should give it a shot. Washington continued to dither, and so the ambassador said, Rose, we're just going to do this. And so he went in and started having conversations with the Rodriguez government. As the political counselor, it was a fascinating job because they really, really didn't know what they were doing. And so, the first time there were people demonstrating, now they were free to demonstrate, they were demonstrating a lot. Every week there was a demonstration about something. And as a military man, Rodriguez's inclination was to shut it down. This is unruly. This is not something we can control. We should stop this. And after a few days, the ambassador, they started getting more and more heavy-handed. The police would be everywhere. Then they brought out dogs on the protesters. And the ambassador went in and said, Mr. President, I'm sorry. In a democracy, we don't sick dogs on the demonstrators. You can ask them to get a permit. You can tell them where they're allowed to demonstrate, but we don't use dogs on the demonstrators. He said, okay, ambassador, I got it. No dogs. We're okay for about a month, and the next demonstration, they bring out the water cannon. They get the fire trucks, and they have the water cannon. The ambassador goes back in. No, Mr. President, no water cannon. Okay, ambassador. And so there was just a whole series of these kinds of events. Finally, they get to elections. He promised they would have elections. They're going to have elections. We're helping them find, the clear plastic ballot boxes so everybody can see the ballots. And we were helping them procure indelible ink so all the voters could dip their fingers in the ink when they vote, so you can't vote again. It's all in line. And then AFL-CIO had an international arm, and there was a very famous guy named Bill Donnelly. And Bill Donnelly was the head of the international unit of the AFL-CIO, and he announced that he was coming to observe the elections. And General Rodriguez was very unhappy. He said, we don't want others telling us how to run our elections. And so the ambassador goes back in and has another conversation. He said, General Rodriguez, do you really think you're going to lose this election? You're the guy who brought down Stroessner. Do you really think the Paraguayan people are going to vote for somebody else? He said, well, no, I think we're going to win. He said, then don't you want everybody in the world to see that you have a free and fair election? And he said, oh, you're right, Ambassador, great idea. We'll pay for the observers. It's like, no, free and fair means they get to see what they see. And so we had a lot of international election observers. He did win the election. He was inaugurated. He took off the uniform, put on his suit, and did a fairly respectable job of launching Paraguay on a path to democracy. But, all of those things that we did, there's no cookbook or recipe book for how to help another country figure out how to be a democracy. And that's the part where people matter. It was, the ambassador was willing to stand up to Washington, willing to go in to have hard conversations with General Rodriguez, and all of us at the embassy were running around trying to find all the things that could go wrong and help guide them on a productive path. And Paraguay's had some bumps in their democracy since then, but mostly they've stayed on the democratic path. Picture on the bottom right is the Bulgarian financial panic. I won't spend any more time on that one. Just say former communists who changed their name and became socialists didn't understand how to run a market economy, and they tanked their own currency by seizing a bank, not understanding that if they seized one bank, all the banks would be in trouble. And so that demonstration went on to burn the parliament and cause dramatic problems that led to the socialist government being voted out of office. On the upper right is a picture of the aftermath of the earthquake in El Salvador in 2001. And 2001, we had a new administration. So George Bush was in office. The earthquakes happened in January, and literally the Clinton administration was packing the boxes, and the earthquake happened, and we were struggling to figure out. They were very damaging. It was the first earthquake. There were two, one in January, one in February. The first one was 7.3 on the Richter scale, so it shook everything down out of the mountains. It broke the Pan American Highway in two places, knocked down all the telecommunications infrastructure, and a lot of houses, and mostly the houses that were occupied by poor people. That, in El Salvador, there weren't skyscrapers, right? They were just, the houses were built of mud and sticks, and when the earth shakes, the mud and sticks just come down. So we spent immediately trying just to get the new Bush administration to pay attention and to get them, organized to try and respond. The Salvadorans asked for help. In Honduras, next door, we had a military helicopter unit, Joint Task Force Bravo, and so we called and asked General Pace to send over the helicopters, and he did. And so for the next 3 weeks, U.S. helicopters helped the Salvadorans fly around and just understand where the damage was, where was the most severe damage, and what were the most immediate needs. And then, the Salvadorans were back up and running, and the helicopters went back to Honduras. But the fact that we had U.S. assets nearby that we were able to bring and help solve the emergency were tremendously valued by the Salvadorans. We went on to then spend, the rest of my tour was about figuring out how we could help the Salvadorans recover. And the reason that this was an American issue in addition to a Salvadoran issue is we knew that if we didn't help the Salvadorans rebuild, the impetus for Salvadorans to leave and come to the United States would be even higher. And so it was very much about getting El Salvador back up on its feet as fast as possible so Salvadorans would stay in El Salvador and not choose to migrate. And then finally, WikiLeaks broke about a month after I got to Peru. And unfortunately, it was during a Peruvian election campaign, and there were WikiLeaks cables about every one of the candidates. And everybody in Washington was completely, overwrought about WikiLeaks and the cables. The newspaper publisher called me to say, we have the WikiLeaks cables from, we got them through the Spanish newspaper and we're going to publish them. And I said, well, that's our intellectual property, so you have no business publishing it. You need to return it to me. It's been stolen, and we would like it back, please. And he said, yeah, no, that's not going to happen, because there's stuff about our election, our candidates, and we think Peruvians have a right to know. And so I immediately called Washington, and they said, yeah, you can't talk about any of that stuff. I said, well, here's the problem. If we don't, it'll get out with no context, and they will use it against each other. Some of the cables were really damaging. One of the candidates had a history of drug abuse and beating his wife. And if you have that put in the mouth of the American government all over the newspaper, it wasn't going to be helpful for them or for us. There were a lot of cables about the sitting president, Alan Garcia. He was very, very unhappy. One of the cables was written by one of my predecessors who called him a colossal ego, which he was. He had a huge ego, there was no question. But from that moment forward, when that cable was published, every newspaper referred to him as El Ego Colosal, constantly. He was very, very happy. As I used to say to my staff, you know, I was in the penalty box. I didn't see the president for a few months because he was really mad. And finally, you know, there was a public event where I was asked about the relationship with President Garcia, and you know, I did what I hope all good diplomats would do, and I said the United States has nothing but the highest appreciation for President Garcia and his work, and we look forward to continuing to work with him. And after that, I was out of the penalty box, and we moved on. This is another one of those Face of America moments. So this is my last 4th of July celebration at the embassy, and that's the Marine Security Guard Detachment who were at the 4th of July reception. In the diplomatic world, National Day receptions are kind of a standard party. You know, the ambassador invites everybody to their house, and you drink some wine and you have some hors d'oeuvres. So the first time I went to one of those 4th of Julys hosted by my embassy was in El Salvador, and it was just terrible. There we all were in the tropics at noon in the living room, lifting, you know, our champagne glasses to toast the United States. And I said, after everybody left, I said to the American staff, does any of you feel like you just went to an American 4th of July event? And they said, well, no, but this is how it's done. I said, no, this is not how it's done anymore. From now on, the 4th of July will look like an American 4th of July. We are going to have hot dogs, we're going to have hamburgers, we're going to have blue jeans, we're going to have fireworks. You know, our job is to share our country with our hosts. And so for my second 2 years in El Salvador and all 3 years in Peru, we had an American 4th of July to celebrate 4th of July. The other thing that people had gotten into the habit of was moving the 4th of July. If it wasn't convenient for it to be on a Sunday, then they would have it on the Monday. I was like, well, we don't celebrate the 5th of July in the United States. We celebrate the 4th of July. So the 4th of July will always be on the 4th of July. Thank you very much. But, you know, and that, as I say, that was my last one, and people loved it. You know, the idea that they were getting, you know, we had baked beans and potato salad, and the fact that they were getting a taste of what it's like to do 4th of July in the United States, I think was one of those Face of America moments. And this is what I call the mayor of a small town moment. So when you're the American ambassador in an embassy, in addition to being the American ambassador and the face to the rest of the world, you also have an American embassy community. So, you know, this happens to be in Peru. In Peru, we had 16 U.S. government agencies besides the State Department. So we had the Department of Agriculture, we had the Department of Commerce, we had the Department of Defense in all of its many iterations. So we had 16 U.S. government agencies, and we had 965 people in total. Of those 965, 275 were Americans from all those different agencies. And so we had a Girl Scout troop. And we had some embassies, we had Boy Scouts. In this particular embassy, we had more Girl Scouts than Boy Scouts. And so, you know, one of the things, this was for the Girl Scouts with merit badge about civics and understanding their government. And so they came to that was at the ambassador's residence in Lima, and so they came one Saturday morning, and we worked through, we had different people from the embassy helping them work through their merit badge requirements. And so for me, that's a reminder that in addition to being the face of America, you're also the mayor of a small town. So these are some photos of American, you know, some of my memorable moments. That picture on the bottom left is President Bush in El Salvador with President Flores. After the earthquakes, we did in fact get a meeting at the White House. President Flores was invited to come up and meet with President Bush. It was probably about 3 weeks after President Bush's inauguration, and they had a very positive conversation. They became very, you know, they were very much, they saw the world the same way. President Flores was fairly conservative. He was fiscally very responsible. He monitored government expenditures with a very close eye and cut people off and took money away from people who weren't spending it productively. And so he and President Bush became quite good friends, and they attended a lot of international conferences together. But after the earthquake, President Bush came to El Salvador to kind of to have a look at all of the reconstruction work that we were doing, but also to demonstrate his support for an ally. The middle picture is President Humala, who was the president of Peru, meeting with President Obama in the Oval Office. And the two of them had very similar agendas. President Humala was elected on an agenda he called social inclusion. He said Peru is a very wealthy country. A lot of people are making a lot of money, but the poorest people aren't getting that money. It's not trickling down to poor people. And so his agenda was to try and help everybody participate in that prosperity. Well, President Obama, didn't call it social inclusion, but his agenda was very similar. And so from that meeting was the official meeting. We actually were in the White House before President Humala was inaugurated on just a quick working visit. And but they saw each other repeatedly at international meetings, and President Obama always made time for President Humala. Humala was a former military leader who had attempted a coup against his government. And so again, when Humala was elected, everybody in Washington was like, oh no, gotta keep our distance. This is a bad guy. He was a coup leader. We don't necessarily want to have anything to do with him. And we sat around in the embassy and we talked about it, and we said, well, we ought to set some red lines. If there are certain things he does, if he tries to nationalize U.S. companies, if he tries to limit, interactions with the United States, if we see signs he's involved in drug trafficking, then we should not have a relationship with him. But we should start out assuming the best and see where we can work together. And then, we'll have these red lines to sign warning signs. And so, I wrote that up. I sent it as a first-person cable from the ambassador to Washington. And President Obama read that message and came back and said, yes, that's what we're going to do. We're going to try it. If he proves to be a reliable interlocutor, we'll continue to work with him. But if he crosses any of the lines, then we won't. And I honestly believe that their repeated interactions over Humala's time in office, they met together at least 10 times. In Washington, all around the world, and I will always believe that President Obama's engagement with President Humala was the thing that kept him on a positive path. And then the picture on the right was Secretary Clinton visiting us in Lima. That's the embassy building in the background. And she came over to meet all of the embassy staff. For a lot of our Peruvian employees who worked at the embassy for years and years, they very seldom got an opportunity to see a visiting Secretary of State. And so her willingness to come to the embassy after a long day of public events, she came and hung out and hugged all the babies and met the embassy staff, and it was a huge morale boost for the embassy staff. And then there were some of those moments that were less happy. At the time I joined the Foreign Service in 1981, women were still not predominant, and we're still not predominant, but women in the Foreign Service were still a novelty. And so, when I went to Paraguay to be the political counselor, the outgoing ambassador interviewed me in the hallway standing up, and at the end of the interview said to me, I'm sorry, I know people here think well of you, but a 28-year-old woman can't do this job. Happily, he was the outgoing ambassador, and the incoming ambassador decided that I could do the job. But, I include that here just as a point, but that was still a moment where people would say, we're not sure if a woman can do this job. This is a tough job. It's political military affairs. I was the first woman to be the principal deputy assistant secretary in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, because women don't do military stuff, for heaven's sake. So I also felt like my career was, kind of also saw a lot of progress for women. When I was promoted before I went out to Paraguay, a colleague who had worked with me, who was one of, who worked with me closely for 3 years, when the promotion list came out, looked at me and said, well, they've got to promote someone to make the statistics look good. And it was just so offensive that someone who worked with me every day for 3 years thought that that was the reason I got promoted. And then when I went off to Bulgaria to be the Deputy Chief of Mission, you see my career, I was mostly in Latin America. I did not serve in Europe. But the outgoing ambassador had been Larry Eagleburger's Chief of Staff. And when Larry Eagleburger hired me to go and work for him, one of the reasons was because he knew that in Eastern Europe, the former Eastern European countries, we were going to need a different kind of diplomatic approach. And he thought those of us who had worked on democracy building in Latin America had the skills he needed. And so I was hired to go to Bulgaria, not because I had any expertise in Bulgaria, but because I did have experience anyway in working on democracy and human rights in Latin America. And so a woman who I knew in the European Bureau called me one day to say, everyone down here is buzzing about the fact that Bill has chosen you to be his DCM. And I said, well, I hope that's good buzz. And she said, well, no, Rose, it's not good buzz. You know, why are you taking a job away from someone who earned it? That was the last conversation we ever had. I said, well, Laura, I'm sorry you feel that way, but clearly the ambassador believes I have skills he needs in that embassy. And, you know, we, in fact, in Bulgaria, were able to have the first political primary in the history of that country. You know, they had this former, I mentioned the socialists who used to be communists and just changed their name. There was a democratic opposition. President Zhelev had been a political prisoner. There were a lot of different opposition groups, and we knew that if they all ran their own presidential candidate, that the socialists would continue to win. And so working with the National Republican Institute, which was, you know, as a U.S., had been supported by the U.S. government as the international arm, the National Republican Institute convinced President Zhelev, the sitting president, to participate in the primary and to abide by the results. And so we held the first political primary, and all the political opposition candidates participated, and Zhelev lost. The leader of the opposition, Petr Stoyanov, won the primary. He went on to win the election and become president of Bulgaria. And that was USAID funded that political primary at the recommendation of the National Republican Institute. So, you know, I talked before about, you know, expanding democracy as being one of our themes. You know, the administration clearly saw that we were going to need that in Eastern Europe, and people who had served in London and Paris and Rome didn't have those skills. By and large, people who served in London and Paris and Rome were folks who had handed off the same contacts that the embassy had had for decades. And they were not used to going in and talking to people about how to hold an election and how to have successful election observation. The last bit is libraries. So, why am I in Smith County? I came to Smith County because I believe in the power of public libraries. I believe that our democracy is only successful if we have informed voters, and the library's job is to help people access that information. We have a lot of wonderful programs. We have a lot of wonderful services here. And I think, you know, one of the critical needs in this community is early literacy. The story times that we do every week in all of our libraries are intended to help kids be ready for kindergarten. You know, the state of Virginia tells us that 45% of Smith County students are not ready for kindergarten when they get there. And so the library's small contribution is to try and help with our story times to make as many kids ready for kindergarten as we possibly can. And I think it's important work, and so when I was offered the opportunity to come here and do it, I agreed.
Thank goodness.
Yes. Here are a couple of resources if you want to know, or people you know want to know more about the State Department. There is a National Museum of American Diplomacy. They have online exhibits, and one of their online exhibits is all of Madeleine Albright's brooches, the famous brooches that she used to wear. Have y'all seen those stories? Yeah, there's a whole book about them. So they have an exhibit at the museum. There is also the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, and they have done a lot of oral histories where they've recorded American diplomats talking about their careers, kind of like I've talked with y'all today. So if you're interested in more of those, the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training has those. And there are a couple books, Inside the U.S. Embassy, and then there's a fun novel called Embassy Wife by Katie Crouch, which is a novel written from the perspective of an embassy wife, what it's like to be the spouse that gets dragged around the world. And I will close by saying, none of my career would have been possible without my spouse. I am fortunate enough to have married a man who believed that public service was worthwhile and who let his life be upended by constantly following me around the world and very often being primarily responsible for raising our children. And so, as much as I enjoyed my career, it would not have been possible without my wonderful spouse. Do y'all have any questions? Yes, Patricia.
Well, thank you for sharing your wonderful story of your career. Let's say you're an ambassador somewhere in the world right now. Would the elimination of Voice of America and USAID impact your job, and if so, how would it be impacted?
USAID, depending on which country you're serving in. Voice of America, less as an embassy employee overseas. So Voice of America transmitted directly to foreign populations. And so they had transmitters and all of that. So the embassy didn't really get involved with Voice of America. In fact, there were times when we would be a little cranky with Voice of America because they would report stories that made host governments unhappy. And I remember calling someone at Voice of America once to say, you're making my life a little uncomfortable because the Salvadoran government doesn't like some of the stories you're publishing. And they said, well, too bad, Ambassador, because we are a journalistic entity and we report what we believe to be true. And so whether it's convenient for the embassy or the government is less important to us. We have credible sources and we use credible sources. So, they were part of the US government, but we didn't interact with them all that often. USAID, absolutely. As you saw, I served in what we used to call developing countries, right? I didn't serve in London or Paris or Rome. I served in developing countries. And that's where USAID worked. If you work in London or Paris or Rome, you probably never knew anybody from USAID. But in my embassies, absolutely. We had USAID in Paraguay, we had USAID in El Salvador, and in Peru. In El Salvador, they were very much the agent of all of the reconstruction. We built 28,000 homes for low-income Salvadorans after the earthquake. And we did it with sweat equity, where USAID bought the materials and hired a lot of different NGOs, Samaritan's Purse, Save the Children, UNICEF, different NGOs, took on responsibility in certain cities or towns, and they would then work with the folks who had been affected by the earthquake, and they would buy the materials, but everybody who was getting a home participated in constructing their home. And different organizations had a different methodology, but the most common methodology was, everybody would start by doing their foundation, and they would do all the foundations. And everybody worked on everybody's house to get it done quickly. And then everybody would do the walls, and then you'd go all the way around. And so, it was so that to keep everybody engaged, but also for people to be proud of what they built for themselves. And none of that could have happened without USAID. They had a disaster recovery it used to be called the Office of Humanitarian Assistance. And they had relief supplies pre-staged at different points around the world. So when the earthquake happened in El Salvador, the first thing we needed was shelters. I mean, people were living in the rubble. They needed shelters. And so there were, USAID had plastic tarps already pre-cut, and they delivered them at the embassy, and we sat there one day, we had a Saturday work day where everybody came, and we packaged all the materials people needed for a shelter. We used the soccer field outside the Marine House and kind of made kits with all of the tarps to distribute to folks. So for me, USAID was a really important partner. And I think most embassies in less developed countries or developing countries had a USAID presence. Every one of those houses that we built had a shield on it that said, "A gift from the American people." See?
It's been so interesting
it seems to me that our democracy is under threat right now. And I heard you mention the word democracy many times throughout your talk. So how could what's happening today affect the State Department and your job as what you're supposed to do?
Well, you know, as I said, as part of the executive branch, you work for the president. And as a diplomat, as a foreign service officer, your responsibility is to execute the president's foreign policy. Yeah, there are a lot of people in the world who think that we've lectured people about democracy a lot. Condi Rice used to talk about our democracy as in the process of perfection, saying that we're not a perfect democracy, we are in the process of perfecting our democracy. And the example she used to give was, she said, you know, at the birth of our nation, my ancestors counted as 2/3 of a person. And so she would say to people, you know, we're not here to lecture and give people lessons about democracy. We're here to tell you that we believe democracy is the best path for all of us, that democracies tend not to go to war with one another. It is the best way for all of us together to be prosperous. And so I think, you know, that the world is watching us. There is no question that the world is watching us. There is no question that people are asking questions about the health of our democracy. We've certainly seen events that, you know, if I were serving overseas in a country that was experiencing what we were experiencing, I would say to Washington, you know, the system is under stress. And I think our system is under stress.
Does your department,
Please.
does your department have anything to do with the Olympics?
The State Department always works well with the International Olympic Committee. So the International Olympic Committee is a separate international organization. But, you know, for example, when the Olympics were in London, you know, there was a huge special task force set up at the embassy in London for all of the U.S. government agencies that were going to have to be involved. So there's always a VIP visit, right? Somebody from the White House is going to go, whether it's the president, the vice president, the first lady, somebody's going to go. So right away, the Secret Service is there from the beginning because they want to know everything. The public affairs people are involved. You have to deal with all of the, you know, these are Americans going overseas. And so you have to deal with the safety and security for all the American athletes. I'm sorry, I talk with my hands. I keep hitting this microphone. So yes, there is always, you know, a State Department liaison, but the International Olympic Committee is a separate international organization. Isaac.
Okay, going back to the very beginning of your program, you talk about the financial impact that certain aspects of that would affect our economy, and you listed I would say the income to the United States from the foreign students is your bottom, and we've just been recently learning about the amount of tuition that foreign students pay to the universities. But in the United States, there are thousands and thousands of foreign exchange students. This town has been filled with, we have a long history, at least a 50-year history with foreign exchange, for high school, foreign exchange students. Would that be computed into that number, or would you even have an idea?
I wouldn't know, Isaac. That number is probably based on university only, because at the university level, foreign students pay full fare, right? They're not getting scholarships, they're not getting financial aid, they're paying the full ride. And so colleges and universities love international students. The high school exchange students, it's harder to measure the impact because typically they're staying with a family. And while they're going to spend some stuff, they're not going to rent an apartment. They're probably eating most of their meals at home. And so it's a less measurable impact on the economy. But that impact is based on, you know, paying tuition, renting an apartment,
Okay,
buying meals.
all right, just curiosity.
Dr. Watson?
This is a little tangential, but did you go to Machu Picchu?
I did 3 times.
Really? Can you give me the flavor of?
It is really an exceptional, extraordinary place. You know, I am not a kind of woo-woo kind of person. I'm not. I'm very grounded in reality and facts. But it is very three-dimensional. And when you go, you know, you're up literally on the side of a mountain, and I just felt such a sense of peace and quiet there. And you're very conscious of kind of being on the side of a mountain. They don't know what Machu Picchu was, right? Was it the Incas' summer palace? Was it an experimental agricultural facility? Because there are terraces all the way down and there are irrigation systems built into the whole complex. And so, you know, one theory is that it was an agricultural station. At the top, there are clearly what are religious temples. And so there's another theory that says, you know, it was a religious center for the Inca. You know, and the Incas were the last native people in Peru. So Peru has had civilization for 5,000 years. And, you know, there were a lot of different Indian civilizations. And the Incas were the ones that were in power when the Spanish arrived in Peru. And you know, they were very successful in spreading their reign across South America with the Inca Trail. So pieces of the Inca Trail still exist. The Inca Trail runs from, you know, the southern part of Colombia all the way down to Argentina. And so the Incas kind of controlled that whole network. And so, you know, one of the theories was that, you know, Machu Picchu was the center of that communication because the Inca Trail leads right up to Machu Picchu. But yeah, it is just exceptionally beautiful. And when I was ambassador, we had a huge controversy because Yale had a lot of artifacts from Machu Picchu, and they wouldn't return them. When Hiram Bingham rediscovered Machu Picchu, Peruvians will say he didn't discover it because it was never lost. We knew it was there. But he rediscovered it in 1916, and the Peruvian government allowed him to bring a lot of the artifacts back to the United States on loan. Well, the loan expired. The Peruvians, for whatever reason, didn't ask for the stuff back. Alan Garcia's government asked for the stuff back. Well, he wasn't the first one. Previous presidents had asked for the stuff back, but Alan Garcia, because it was the 100th anniversary of Machu Picchu's rediscovery, wanted the artifacts back. And so they threatened to put out an Interpol warrant for the president of Yale because he wouldn't return the artifacts. And, you know, Condi Rice's, it was Hillary Clinton's chief of staff, had been a provost of Columbia University, and she called the president of Yale and said, look, you're on the wrong side of history here. You need to give this stuff back. And they did. They finally did. And when they returned it, it was a live televised event. They had a huge cargo truck that met the airplane. They put it on the truck, and the truck was emblazoned with, you know, Machu Picchu artifacts finally returned home. All the live TV coverage followed it to the president's palace. They had a huge display. They put all the stuff on display and opened the palace to the public. That display ran for 3 months, and every day people filed through to see those artifacts. Now, were the artifacts precious gold and silver? For the most part, no. I mean, it was pottery, it was onyx, there were different pieces, but this was not the treasures of Tutankhamun by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, so Machu Picchu, I went several times. One of the times was after that. President Garcia insisted that we demonstrate that we were friends again by going together to Machu Picchu. So we did that. The last time I went, I had to go because we had a credible threat that American tourists were going to be kidnapped from Machu Picchu. And at the time I was in Peru, every single day 1,200 Americans landed at the airport in Lima. 1,200 a day. A lot of people go to Machu Picchu.
It's primarily a tourist.
It is, and it's now been so heavily over visited that they put limits on the number of people who can go every day. And they were starting to do that when I was there, but now there are very strict limits on the number of people who can go. But I had to put out a warning that said to Americans, we have a credible threat that Sendero Luminoso is going to kidnap Americans, and we advise all Americans to stay away from Machu Picchu until further notice. This was wildly unpopular. When you're bringing in 1,200 people a day, that's a lot of money for everybody. And they were deeply, deeply unhappy with me. I was in the penalty box again. President or his wife wouldn't return my calls. But it was the right thing to do. Americans have a right to go where they want to go, but I have an obligation to tell them if I think they're in danger. And so I promised that after the danger was over, that I would personally go back to demonstrate that it was safe to go to Machu Picchu. So, the police patrolled the area. They did capture some of the people. A lot of the other people left the area. But the police and the military were obviously very nervous that the president was watching them, so they swooped in. We got reliable information that the threat was gone, and so I said, okay, it's okay for everybody to go back. And I made the All Is Safe tour and went through Machu Picchu with the mayor. There are some very unflattering photographs of me wearing a poncho and a hat and all this stuff, because the mayor insisted that I had to not just go, but I had to wear the local garb. So I did. It's the Face of America part, making those relationships. Yes.
What year was that?
That would have been 2012.
Speaking of credible threats and danger, where were you on 9/11 and what was your experience?
I was in El Salvador, and as it so happened, I had a meeting scheduled with President Flores that day, and he and I generally saw each other at least once a month, one-on-one, just the two of us. We might see each other for other things, other meetings, but once a month we tried to sit down, just the two of us, to talk about what was going on, where we were moving, where we were not making progress. And it so happened that day, I was sitting in my office and I have the news on every morning, the American news, and I was sitting in my office when I saw the plane hit the tower. And I thought, oh God. And I almost canceled the meeting, and then I thought, no, actually, I better go, because we're gonna have some stuff to talk about. But suddenly, we couldn't communicate with the State Department, right? One of the things that happened was, everybody was—
The bomb threat wasn't there at this
Yeah, there were reports that the State Department had been hit too. In Arlington, Virginia, on the Foreign Service Institute campus, is the Alternative Operations Center. And so there was a plan for everybody to move to that alternate facility in case of this kind of emergency. And that's what happened. But it was a couple hours where we tried to call, we tried to cable, we couldn't get any communication. And so, this is why they pay you the big bucks. You have to figure out, okay, I'm disconnected from Washington, what do I need to do? So the first thing you need to do is, am I at risk? Is my facility at risk? Are my people at risk? What do I need to do to, tuck everybody up and stay safe? And so it was in fact pretty helpful that I already had a meeting with the president who said, whatever you need, you got it. And so the Salvadorans were great. They declared a no-fly zone over the embassy, and so no aircraft were allowed to overfly the embassy. They came and brought big tanks and trucks and closed off all the roads around the embassy so nobody could get to us. All of us had, we had children at the American school, and so they provided, guards at the American school. But it was a scary time, and kind of suddenly, we had been working the reconstruction agenda from the earthquakes, and now suddenly it was all about counterterrorism and keeping people safe. But we had, then we had commemorative events. I remember at the 1 month anniversary of 9/11, we had an event in El Salvador, and the president came and sat with us. 23 Salvadorans died in the World Trade Towers, And so, you know, he said in all of his statements, this wasn't just an attack on the United States. This was an attack, you know, we lost Salvadorans in the World Trade Center. So they were extremely supportive, and as you know, as I mentioned, they later sent troops to Iraq because they felt like it was an attack on them too. Mom?
A lot of people have trouble with the Junior Foreign Service Officers exam. What's the secret to passing it? I mean, it's pretty difficult test.
Yes, it was famously difficult. When I joined, they used to say 20,000 people take the exam, 2,000 people pass the written exam, those 2,000 people are invited to the oral exam, and of those 2,000, 200 will be invited to join the Foreign Service. It was a lot of everything, and it's very different now. I mean, obviously they change it all the time, but it was a lot about understanding world history. It was a little bit of economics. It was a little bit of current events. The oral exam, for me, you know, I couldn't actually believe when I got the notice that I passed the written exam. Nobody was more surprised than me. And then, you know, getting ready for the oral exam. The oral exam is a whole day, and you go to Washington and there's a panel of examiners. Again, this is what it used to be. It's not exactly this way anymore. There was a panel of 3 sitting Foreign Service examiners, and I started the day with an interview with the 3 of them asking me questions, and then you go on to what they call, I forget the term they used, but it was a typical workday desk. And so they took you to a room and sat you at a table, and you had an inbox, and you had an hour to deal with everything in the inbox. And there were, you know, all kinds of things. A report of an American who had been robbed, a request for, you know, somebody to attend a reception, you know, kind of a typical embassy inbox. And so you had to write up your response to all the things in the inbox. And then the last part of the day was you were in a room with 3 other applicants. You were each given a candidate, and you were told that the 4 of you were a committee that was deciding who could visit the United States on a visitor program, an official visitor program. Each of you had to advocate for a candidate, and the 4 of you could only choose 3 people. So somebody's candidate wasn't going to be successful. And you were, you know, you were being observed. They told you you were being observed. So they were kind of testing your interpersonal skills, your negotiation skills, you know, did you successfully advocate for your candidate, and, you know, what arguments did you make? So it has changed a little bit, because one of the things about the Foreign Service is historically it has not been very representative of our population, right? It is primarily white. It is primarily male. You know, there are a lot more women now than there used to be, but, you know, there are many fewer, you know, as a percentage of the population. You know, the percentage of blacks in the Foreign Service does not match the percentage in the population. The percentage of Asians and Hispanics does not, in the Foreign Service, match their presence in the population overall. So they have made a lot of efforts to try and recruit everywhere, not just from East Coast schools, which is, you know, kind of predominantly where Foreign Service officers have come from. You know, in the early days of the Foreign Service, regular Americans couldn't afford to be diplomats because you had to pay everything yourself. So only wealthy people could be diplomats because they had to pay their own transportation, they had to pay the housing, they had to pay all the expenses of, you know, hosting events for local contacts. So in the old days, only rich people could afford to be Foreign Service officers. That's no longer the case. The Foreign Service Act of 1981 kind of professionalized the Foreign Service and established a separate personnel system, a separate retirement system, very much like the military, based on rank in person. The civil service, it's rank in job. So you're a GS-13 because your job is ranked as a GS-13. And you get to be a GS-13 by, you know, applying for and getting a GS-13 job. That is not, the Foreign Service is like the military. So when I was, you know, whatever rank I what, you know, the various ranks, minister, counselor, that went with me wherever I went. And, you know, we were trying to go to a job with the appropriate ranking, but that rank went with me wherever I went. Much like the military, there's also what they call time in class, and it's kind of up or out. You have to continue to be promoted or you have to leave. Very much like the military. The military has the same system, that at every level, you have a certain number of years to get promoted to the next level. And so the Foreign Service Act of 1981 kind of created that whole system. But the test now is designed to give people an opportunity to not just pass the test, but if they have experience living and working overseas, to write an essay explaining what they've learned from living and working overseas. If they have language skills, they get extra points on the test. I got no points for speaking Spanish, but now they have priority languages. If you speak Chinese or Arabic or Japanese, they get extra points in the assessment process because we're trying to bring in people. If we have to teach someone to speak Chinese, that's 2 years out of their career, 2 years that we're paying them and housing them to learn the language. If someone comes to us with Chinese, then we've saved all that money. And so they add, you know, they give incentives for people who speak Chinese or hard languages. Anything else? Well, you all have been terrific coming, and